Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program. This is Mike Console. Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. Thank you for joining us. We are going to blow your mind today because I've got a polymath. And because you're writers and readers, I expect you to know what the term polymath means. He's basically a Renaissance man, as much as you can be in this day and age, because as we know, what data is accumulating. I think we've created more data in like the last 5 years than all of human history combined before that. Or 20 years, maybe it is. It's phenomenal. It is phenomenal. And my point being that there is way too much to actually know to be a Renaissance man in the sense that, say, Leonardo da Vinci was a Renaissance man. But nonetheless, we have certain people who really not just understand the way the world works in many fashions, but they also write about it. They don't only write about it, they pose relevant questions, really, because wasn't it Voltaire who said, don't judge a man by his answers, judge him by his questions. That's not an exact quote, but that is it. And I've always said to people, when do you know that you've achieved wisdom? It's when you have more questions than answers. And my guest today is into artificial intelligence. He's into writing. He's into deep thinking. He's into data analytics. And when you stop and think about, and the other part of this is that he asks a lot of questions, a lot of provocative questions that he doesn't necessarily claim to know the answers to, although I think he's going to supply us with some of those. Now, his name, and I'll introduce him here in a minute, but his name is Filip Dousek. He's joining me via the internet from beautiful Prague, Czechoslovakia. It's one of those great historic cities. I've been to a lot of cities in Europe, and I have yet to get to Prague. I've been to Budapest and Vienna and Nuremberg. One day I hope to sit and have a glass of wine with Filip Dousek when I get to Prague. If he's still there, he may go on a world tour for all I know. So he, again, is an artificial intelligence and analytics expert. He was the founder and CEO of a company called Stories.bi. It's one of the first startups that automated big data analysis. And get a load of this, Gartner, which does a lot of tracking. It's a research and basically a research firm. The company Gartner named Stories.bi Gartner, a Gartner cool vendor. Okay, that's a designation, Gartner cool vendor. They obviously thought a lot of it. But here's something even bigger. The company was acquired by Workday. Workday, the big company that's in human resources, Workday that was founded by Dave Duffield, who I have interviewed. He is now in his 80s. He's a billionaire. He started the company called PeopleSoft before that, which suffered a hostile takeover by Larry Ellison and Oracle Corporation. Dave Duffield started Workday with the commitment, with the vow that he would never let that happen to his company again. He structured this new company in a way that nobody could ever take it away from him. He thought so much of Stories.bi that he bought the company. And not bad when a billionaire and a serial entrepreneur buys your company. Now the technology is getting really good traction and is it's still pioneering AI-powered analysis. But before he started that company, Filip Dousek wrote a novel. It took him 12 years to complete and was about a Cambridge PhD coding artificial intelligence to find God. God, G-O-D, that's with a capital G. The supreme being, the infinite, the primordial source of all that is. Some of you believe in it, some of you don't. Some of you, we have so many names and spiritual traditions for it. It's such a powerful force out there, one way or the other, for people who believe and don't believe. We'll find out if Filip Dousek believes or not, and what's the nature of this and what his book has to tell us about that. So it's not just about this PhD Cambridge professor coding AI to find God. It's also about the order of the universe. Remember, we're still looking for a unified theory of the universe. Albert Einstein got us partway there, not all the way there. Or at least this fictional Cambridge PhD professor, or maybe not professor, he's a PhD anyway. He is at least looking at the mother of all fractals. Fractals, you've ever heard of Fractal Painter? That's a software program that artists use. I couldn't even tell you what a fractal is, but my guest could tell us that. And we might get there, we might not. We have a lot to talk about. So it's also about the cultural shift from objects to relationships, and how it will change everything we know, everything as we know it. In short, he wrote this book titled Flock Without Birds, which sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Flock Without Birds. He wrote it in 2012 as fiction. A few years later, he built that company I was just talking about, stories.bi, and made it real. Is that for real? I mean, is that true? We'll find out. There's just so much to say about these kinds of topics. And Filip Dousek, he's interested in the illusions. Here's some of the subject matter we're going to talk about. He's interested in the illusions that underlie everything we do, from politics to economics to media. What are those illusions? This summer, he's publishing his first novel. That's Flock Without Birds. I believe this is going to be one of two books. We'll get into that, and I think they can be read in either order. He's not doing this sequentially. Let's face it, if you're doing things in a linear fashion, you might actually be violating the laws of physics. This guy's not about to do that. Now, the book was a bestseller in his native Czech Republic. It's going to be available. It is now available in the United States. I understand it will be, the audio version will come out around July, with some all-star readers from Audible. And the novel is, I'm reading from a few notes here that I got from his publicist. It's a mind-altering original about the illusions that we create in our world. And no doubt we create illusions. Don't we all have these narratives? We tell ourselves these stories about ourselves. Are they true? If you ask other people, most of the time they'll say, you don't really understand yourself, do you? Because we don't see ourselves as other people see us. We don't see the world as the world sees us, I don't think. So this is an experimental format, okay, that he's writing. Two books in one, but they're being done separately. And the reader can decide which one to read first. Now, all of the stuff I just said is subject to review and delusion on my part in Filip Dousek's analysis, because here I am speaking for him and he's patiently waiting for me to shut up and say, Filip Dousek, welcome to Novelist Spotlight.
Mike, thank you very much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And I'm so curious in which directions we will be taking this conversation now. I think there are a few rabbit holes where we could go.
Absolutely. Let's start with the illusions. I'm going back. You have a really cool website that does this kind of duality thing. If you slide to one side, it reverses out as white type on a black background. You slide to the other side, it's black type on a white background. So it's almost yin yang. You can see, Filip, you put a lot of thought into this. And on your site, you talk about, I want to start with this phrase that you use on your site, which says here, oh boy, your site is a little slippery right now for me. It's so dynamic that it's almost hard to navigate. Talk about, though, actually, let's start with the two volumes. So you've got one written. You wrote it 12 years ago. It's out there. Is the other one underway? Is it completed?
Okay, so let me comment on this. So both of the volumes will be in the reader's hands when they buy this book. Okay, it's basically a novel that comes out in two volumes, but both of them are already out. we don't have video.
Are they
here,
contained within the single book, you're saying?
That's correct. Yes. So it's basically the book doesn't have a front cover and a back cover, but it has two front covers, and you can start reading from either side.
I love it. Now it reads sequentially from the back to the. Are these? How does that work? If you're reading from back to front, you're just reading the face pages. You're not. Is that how it works? You read one side, not if you have the book open to two pages, you're only reading one side. Tell us how that works.
So the two volumes meet in the middle, and so you will always be reading essentially from page one, whether you pick the black side, which is called the book, or whether you pick the white side, which is called the story. And just to make things a little more complicated, the story is the story of the book. So they are very much interrelated, the story and the book. And whichever beginning the reader chooses as their starting point, they will only get one kind of reading experience. They cannot possibly choose both options, which is, I'll start with the black one and then I'll read the white one, and after that I will flip the order. But they have already by then had the experience of the first reading, right? So it's essentially an irreversible choice where you either walk one way or the other, and you do not know what that really influences and what that means, and you will never be able to take that other choice. And that's really it might sound like a trick on a reader, right? But I see
experimental
that
fiction. Experimental fiction, right?
Yes, and at the same time,
are they both fiction? Let me ask you a few rapid fire questions here. Is your Cambridge PhD in both books?
Yes.
And and they're both fiction, okay? And are they both written in the same tone, the same tonality, or do you actually change the voice from one to the other?
So no, the voice is different. Each of those volumes has basically a different narrator. The book, that's the shorter one, the black one, is a journal by the Cambridge PhD, which he's writing in India, where he, through an unfortunate chain of events, gets into a jail, and he's reflecting on basically his philosophical findings that he has come to through his life. And the white book is narrated by someone else, and that is much closer, really, to what you would typically call fiction, and it is the story of the Cambridge PhD, Adam,
in a search for God, the existence of God.
In a search for God, and getting essentially to the point in his life when he starts writing the journal.
How is he searching for God? Is he using algorithms, artificial intelligence? Is that how he's doing it?
Yes, that's right. He's an engineer, a statistician, a data scientist, an engineer, and he's writing software basically to find God, to find significant patterns within random events, to find, as you said, the mother of all fractals, right? There are many different ways how to name something rather powerful that we might have a sense of, but keeps eluding our models and our rational scientific grasp.
That is certainly true of God, or the existence of God. It's certainly true of the universe as well. Every time we think we've got something figured out, it's kind of like, wait a minute, this doesn't hold up to our scrutiny. When we test, it doesn't hold up. Now, some things do. Gravity holds up. I think Einstein's theory has held up, but as I was saying, it's not complete. We don't have a unified theory of the universe yet. Let me ask you this. I mentioned fractal during the introduction. You just mentioned fractal. What is a fractal?
It's a self-recurring pattern.
A self-recurring pattern, which I think there's a lot of people who, from the spiritual realm, and I mean people in the mortal realm, actually, who philosophize about spirituality, that would talk about that recurring pattern, that are saying that there is in fact, they talk about what is the a hologram. If you smash a hologram, and check me on this, Philip, break a hologram, and you can pick up any one piece of that broken hologram and look at it, and it contains the whole. And
that's right.
What they're saying is that each human being actually contains the cosmos within them. That's why you can achieve enlightenment through meditation, through self-reflection, and so on. So, and that's in itself a recurring pattern.
You can see it that way. Yes. There's, for example,
I'm stretching it. I think I'm stretching it.
Well, there's an old.
Nonetheless.
There's an old image. There's an old image from the old Vedic texts of an Indra's web, and this is described, I believe, in the Bhagavad Gita, and it is a web of pearls where each pearl reflects all of the other pearls, and those reflections again contain the reflections, and so on, right? It goes on into essentially an infinite loop of mutual reflections. It's almost like when you're standing between two mirrors, there's something very interesting happening there, right? As the reflections go on and on.
Yes.
And so these ancient texts basically say that this is a model for reality, right? So that's an interesting perspective.
And delusion, right?
As well.
I mean, is that what confuses us about what we think of as reality? For instance, you say truth is a fallacy, and that might be a question set aside. But is part of our the delusion that we live under, this illusion or delusions that we live under, part that these reflections create misunderstandings on our part?
Well, the way I look at it and the way I write about it in the book is that at least we in the Western world, in the Western civilization, we have a set of underlying subconscious assumptions about reality. And these assumptions heavily influence everything about our society. They influence our politics, our institutions, our science, our daily lives, our careers, our relationships, our monogamy or polygamy or whatever form we choose. So so these are very powerful assumptions. What are they? Well, one of the key ones is related to our conception of truth, and there is generally an assumption that there is a certain one way to look at the world, and we call that one way the truth. And we assume that we can, it might be difficult to truly attain this perspective, and we kind of take it that many of us are somehow wrong to an extent, in many different ways, but we still sort of go on with our lives with this assumption that there is something that we call truth. And it's so interesting how ingrained this idea is when we start challenging that, when we start looking at, okay, well, what if that's not the case? Like, what if there are, for example, multiple possible perspectives at basically everything, and they are equally valid? Like that is very disorienting, right? And yet, this seems to be a key shift, I would say, in actually trying to understand the world better, right? It's paradoxical that leaving the notion of truth behind might actually lead us to a better understanding of the world. Because we're
explain that a little bit, because right now we live in a post-truth society. We see this happening around the world with these strong men who say something isn't happening that we can see with our own eyes is happening. There's that part of it. And then there's also denial of science to a large degree. And I'm not talking about climate change. I'm saying because, at least there's an argument to be made that, okay, there's climate change, but we still have yet to prove that we're causing it. This may just be a cycle that we're going through. So that's certainly tenable. But there is also just science comes out with something and politics says, well, that doesn't comport with our platform. So therefore we condemn it and we don't believe it. You're not talking about denying scientific experimentation with affirmative outcomes that are reproducible.
No,
or
I'm
are
not.
you?
No, I'm not.
Okay, you're not.
No, I'm not. And
so
this
talk
is exactly
about how.
So it's an interesting, slippery sort of situation, right? Because whenever I say these days, truth is a fallacy, it might be an apology for a multitude of opinions and ideas that really don't hold up to scrutiny, right? And yet, I still believe it's important to be critical of the concept of truth and to be critical of our current scientific knowledge and methodology, wherever it is, right? Because it's always on a search. When I say truth is a fallacy, that alludes to, on one hand, the inherent complexity of the world. And because whenever we are very certain of something, or whenever we start calling something truth, when we critically dig further, we realize that it's always been a simplification. Okay.
Yes.
So here we could talk about models, for example, right? My background is in data science. So I've spent 20 years working with data models and with trying to capture the world out there as clearly as possible, right? That's what data science really does. It's like we get a lot of information into our systems. I generally work with big data, so we get millions and billions of some data points, and in some sense, these are all true, right? But at the same time, we're actually living something like an inflation through an inflation of truth. Because if you have 1 billion data points, or if you have, if you have a magazine, an online magazine with 100,000 articles, these might all be to some degree true, but it essentially this criterion is no longer useful as a criterion of choice. If I try to use truth as the decision-making criterion for what should I be reading tomorrow, it's not helping me, right? So that's my first point about truth. Like we need to be switching actually to different criterions of choice and to criterions like usefulness and so on.
Let me ask you this. Give me an example of what you consider to be an assumption that we make, human beings make, that doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Right. So I will go to a fairly extreme point here. Okay. If you ask most people, well, is 1 + 1, does it equal 2? Right. I think probably over 95% of people will tell you, yeah, sure, that's a pretty essential fact about the universe. That's just true. There's nothing more true than 1 + 1 = 2. And yet, okay, we can, so if we look at this, okay, but is it really true, right? And we can approach this from two different directions at least. So the first one would be mathematical. Okay? Is that actually really in some way a foundation of our mathematics, that 1 + 1 = 2? Well, when you start looking into that, you'll find that, well, this is not axiomatic, right? This is this expression actually stands on our conception of numbers, on our conception of the operator plus, on our conception of the operator is equal to, right? And these are all variable. Like we could build mathematics with a very different meaning of the operator plus. The Roman decimals, for example, that were used throughout the civilized world for thousands of years, the mathematicians using Roman literals wouldn't understand what 1 + 1 = 2 means, right? So when we start,
so it's a concept. It's a concept.
Exactly. When we start challenging each of these building blocks of the concept, we start seeing that, well, actually, exactly, this is a fairly complex concept that we just use as a building block, and we don't spend much time challenging it because it's pretty useful, right? But if we wanted to, we could have been working with an alternate version of this concept, which only shows that, well, the original conception of truth as applied to this maybe, is not as strong and as singular as we tend to assume, right? But then there's a very different perspective from which we could approach this question of 1 + 1 = 2, and that is what my book actually does. So
let me stop you a minute, though, Philip.
Okay.
I want to stop you a minute because this is such a critical question.
Yes.
The 1 + 1 = 2, or the mathematical system, has endured because we've been able to figure things out using it. And physics is all based on mathematics. So if we can call that into question, which I'm not arguing that we can't call it into question. I don't think there's anything we can't call into question. But if we call it into question, then all the mathematics that we've used to figure out the universe, or what reality is, our own reality, we've used mathematics to figure out reality. The entire construct of reality is called into question then, perhaps. Which is,
exactly.
I think, very much what you're saying.
Well, and this is precisely the groundbreaking sort of realization that, for example, mathematicians went through in the early 20th century. There was something, that's called today the crisis of mathematics, and in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a very strong push toward building a complete unified mathematics. And David Hilbert was one of the main proponents of this idea, basically saying, oh, we have these 10 critical unsolved issues in mathematics, and when we resolve these 10 issues, we will have an unassailable foundation for not only mathematics, but for science, for our society. Like, this is what will replace the idea of God that seems to, at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of 19th century, that started to show some cracks, right? Up until 10, for thousands of years, for at least 2,000 years of the Christian, basically, civilization, the human certainties were very much founded on an idea of one God and one pope for most of the time, one church, and so on. And I'm of course talking about the Western civilization here.
All kept very simple. All kept very simple and under control.
Back to the beginning of the 20th century. So David Hilbert basically is driving this charge of mathematicians to provide a new foundation for the society, right? And mathematicians keep working on these problems, and one of the brightest people at the time was a mathematician called Gödel, right, and Kurt Gödel, and he basically proved with his incompleteness theorem that there will never be a complete mathematics, that there will always be certain propositions that cannot be proven or disproven within any mathematical system. And that was exactly sort of what you described a couple of minutes ago to most mathematicians at a time. It was a pretty shattering moment where they needed to start looking at some alternative views of reality itself. And something similar happened around the same time with quantum mechanics, where the simple Newtonian view of the world, in which you can basically describe the movement of all particles and people and objects and planets with a certainty, that broke down as well. And we're still, both in mathematics and in physics and within our society, just living through the rippling waves of that disillusionment.
Tell me this. I actually heard you interviewed by a guy who was getting agitated with you because he was saying, does God exist or not? I mean, what's the answer to that question? So let me ask you, and I want to ask you also about why you decided to pose all of these really ultimate questions in the form of fiction. But do you believe in God, or should that be kept secret since you're an author and people haven't read your book yet, and this is kind of an exploration of so many things? Should that be kept confidential, whether you believe in a supreme being of some kind or not? I understand if the answer is yes. I do.
That's an interesting question. Like, should my personal views somehow influence the books that I am
my
writing,
reading of
right?
it, or everybody else's reading of it?
Or your reading of it, right? But I will abstract from that and answer as a personal question, unrelated to the book. Okay, my view is that while I have spent my entire life basically very much in in the rational realms, right? My background is a combination of mathematics, computer science, and business, and I've worked as an essentially data analyst and AI founder. So I still
it's a big question.
don't think that yes, I still don't think that our current methods of studying the world, as advanced as they are and complex as they are somehow getting to the nature of reality. Okay, and consciousness, for example, and my experience of my own consciousness, it is something that eludes most descriptions. All descriptions, everything that I'm even, for example, saying now, right, seems very crude compared to just...
You're saying to me what got that interview upset. It's like, does God exist? You started speaking elliptically and kind of circling the subject, and he got agitated. And I'm not asking for an answer, a direct answer, because I understand, for instance, Robert, let's just take this is kind of a frivolous example, but I think it's an analogy. Robert De Niro does not like being interviewed because then you know who Robert De Niro is, the man.
Right.
And it's hard to sell himself on screen as a character that he portrays. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, you're the author of this book, and it's entirely plausible that you would say, if people know what I think, rather than, I mean, especially that ultimate question, that the book that's at the core of this book, then the reading experience is somehow affected almost. And to take it to a ridiculous dimension, not ridiculous, it's actually true that physicists have realized that you change the nature of existence by simply observing it, because you've introduced yourself to it. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean?
Yes, precisely. The role of the observer, I think, is absolutely crucial in both physics and in our description of reality, if it should be somehow valid. Yes.
In fact, we have so many assumptions, Philip, that if let's say I was, there's an atheist out there listening, and you said, I believe in God, and this book, ultimately, this Cambridge PhD will prove the existence of God. Because of the assumptions or the beliefs of an atheist, they may just say, I'm not going to waste my time with that. Of course, there's no God. Or vice versa. A believer in God would say, I don't feel that he is really bought into the whole, the deity. And I'm not going to waste my time with him because it sounds like he might be an atheist. So we bring these hidebound beliefs or opinions to something, and then we just write off somebody without listening to them.
Right. So in this sense, just like it's a black book and a white book together, it really explores this question through the eyes of the main character, right? Because and I think I will say this. I think it's a very crucial question, and my main protagonist thinks it is a crucial question. He says basically, look, if there is God, I should be living my life very differently from if there is no God. So before I start making any other choices, I need to answer this, right? I need to know in which reality I am actually living my life. So I am not going to be doing anything else until I find out, right? That's his motivation. And he says, well, and philosophy and religion, those aren't really the right ways to be answering this question in the 21st century. We have computers, we have code, we have artificial intelligence, we have data. We have to use that. We have to see whether there is some pattern within all of the data that we have that is a signal that, it's like we are listening basically to aliens, to potential aliens in space, right? But we're not listening we're not listening for the same signal like here on Earth. And that's a very analogous problem, right? So it doesn't, I don't think you need to believe or disbelieve in aliens in order to search for them. It's like the question is open, and we're driven to search for an answer.
Exactly.
And similarly, in that sense, I don't think it really matters whether I believe in God or not, in order to be posing this question and be writing a book about what happens when someone really takes it seriously.
Mm-hmm. And you engage people on that question, because that's such a powerful question, because most people have, I would say most people are committed to the idea that they either believe in a God or they don't, or at least they're agnostic. It's like, I'll know it when I'm there. I'll know it when I see it. I don't pretend to know the answer, sort of thing. Now, let me ask you this. Because it's this experimental fiction and the way you wrote this, did you have trouble getting an agent and a publishing house to say, we want to publish this? Was it a little too offbeat for them? Was there any difficulty as far as that goes, or did they understand it and embrace it right away?
Okay, so I will say, so yes, I need to say basically I had to create my own publishing company and hire the team that would bring this to the highest possible professional standard to the market. Right, like that was my solution in the end. So I'm wary of the word self-publishing, because this this project from many angles is not a sort of, I would hope.
Oh, so the book was originally self-published. Is it self-published? The big rollout that's happening now, is it self-published?
It is.
It is. Okay, there you go.
Yes. And yet,
you're doing a very professional.
Well,
I mean, the amount of production that's gone into this, and you're a man of resources and of technical knowledge, but the amount of resources that go into it doesn't have that feel whatsoever. But go ahead.
Well, that's the thing, right? I felt like if I go the traditional route, the publishing route, it will in some way alleviate many of my problems. But I will not give the book the thorough care that I wanted it to have. Okay, and since I already had experience with publishing the book originally in the Czech Republic, where it became a bestseller, it sold over 10,000 copies there. We learned a lot. I felt that if I bring together a strong team for the US launch, that we can do a good job as well, and so we have. I had professional editors working on this. I had a professional, very good designer, basically, who is my who did the Czech version as well, and who did this one, and is a very conceptual person and more like a collaborator than just a designer on the whole concept. I have PR company. I have the audiobook, for example, that will be published is narrated by Jonathan Davis and Scott Brick, who are both Audible Hall of Fame narrators. So I basically,
they're great. They're great.
So I thought, okay, what is the best thing that I can do for this book? And that's what I tried to do.
Now, when somebody reads or listens to this book, what do you anticipate them coming away with? Maybe you can say it from what you hope they take away from the book, what their impression is of it, and then maybe there's a second answer to that. I don't know, because you work in kind of these reflections anyway.
There are as many answers to this question as there will be readers, right? And this book definitely supports that diversity of takeaways. But there are some points that I would like to highlight. And one of them is the unofficial subtitle of the book, which is "Truth is a Fallacy." I would hope that the reader will take this sentence and think about it for the next year or two. That they will try to subtract that singular word, truth, from their worldview and explore what happens. And, this is an adventurous path. Like, there are certainly directions that I would not recommend, right? Like, we're seeing it today that many people have opinions which simply don't sound sensible. And I'm not encouraging doubting the bulk of science. I'm not encouraging always having one's own point of view no matter what. Quite the contrary. I'm encouraging questioning narratives, questioning own opinions, own beliefs. So whenever someone thinks, wow, well, there's the truth is being hidden from me, for example, right? Like that, there's this. Sometimes people challenge the bulk of science from this position, like, oh, we're not being told the truth. Usually, in place of that semi-official or consensual truth, they actually implant their own version of truth. Like, they haven't really challenged the idea of truth, right? And that's the part where I would love the readers to go deeper.
Like political gaslighting, and as we call it here in the United States, political gaslighting, which is, I don't know if that term's familiar in Europe, but, just misleading people, just telling people things that aren't true, trying to mislead them for political purposes. And then you've got people who are, whether it's religious, political, social beliefs that they're fixed in, and they therefore say, anybody who tells me otherwise, we're not being told the truth. I mean, those are a couple of really raw examples of it, but you go much deeper than that. It's really this questioning. And I said earlier, Voltaire said, and it's one of my favorite quotes, judge a man by his, don't judge a man by his answers, judge a man by his questions. And so few of us really question anything except for those who are stuck in the kind of this paranoid, conspiracy-oriented dimension, who are reading stuff. They're not, Philip, part of what you're talking about is being discriminating as well. You question why we believe what we believe, and these assumptions that we come in with. Well, why is this my assumption? Why have I always just accepted this? But also discriminating about any information inputs.
Precisely.
You as a data guy, that's so important to you as a data guy. It's like, where's this information coming? Is it garbage in, garbage out? Or am I being discriminating about what I'm collecting and how I'm analyzing it?
Precisely, yes. And what is the model that I'm applying? What are the simplifications? What are the limitations? What does my current model fail to capture? And so on, right? That is the path toward better and better information, toward more and more resonance between one's beliefs and the world out there.
Another phrase you use that I believe is embedded in the book is fear is a compass. Explain that.
Right. So it's interesting how often we rationalize around fear, and I do that. Right. I'm on my own journey, and I pay attention.
And it is human nature, probably, right? It is human nature. It's not just
right. Well, exactly. And I think people who tend to be on the rational side possibly are less aware of the underlying emotions, right? And so here's a sort of trap where one might be fairly unaware of the underlying fear, but being very good at building rational constructs on top of it. And so this is an example of this kind of person is my protagonist, Adam. And Adam simply at one point finds himself in a situation where he does something that goes completely against his logical and rational beliefs, and yet somehow it feels right. And he realizes it's the thing that he has always been scared of for years and years. And he coins this phrase, fear is a compass, and basically says, that is one of those possible navigation devices that I could be using whenever I fear something strongly. Well, that's exactly where I should be going. And in some sense, it sounds illogical, but in the logic of the novels, it might well be one of the best directions one might be going.
Well, and don't we, so many of us spend our lives avoiding all these things that we fear. And there's more and more to fear all the time, it seems, because they tend to multiply if you're a fearful-minded person anyway. And as I was saying, this is human nature, but to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the person. So fear is a compass. We are guided by fear, correct?
It's a strong signal.
Or is that not a proper rewording? If I was to reword it, we are guided by fear, would you say that misses the mark? Maybe that does miss the mark, considering what you're trying to communicate.
In my experience, most people try to avoid fear. They try to avoid whatever causes them to feel fear, right? So here,
I did say that properly.
Yes, the point is,
you're right.
Let yourself be guided by fear. Yes, but perhaps we are not.
You're actually saying,
we could let that happen.
You're almost saying that's a beacon. If there's fear, consider it a beacon and be drawn towards that beacon, not away from it.
Exactly.
And there's certain kinds of fears, obviously, that are healthy fears that we should be guided by. For instance, wild animals when we're unprotected. But you're talking about that we fear things as simple as thinking a little differently, or even questioning our own beliefs, or listening to somebody who has different beliefs.
Right. So when I take that back to the question of truth, truth. This is one of the sentences from the book. Truth is a coping strategy in the face of the great unknown, and the great unknown, feeling that, staying with the question, having no answers, like that is very disorienting. That causes that creates a lot of fear, and I'm nudging the reader to stay in that difficult place somewhat longer.
Okay, let me do this. Let me do a little foreshadowing here. I want to cover 3 things here. Number 1, I want to know why you named your company Stories.bi, because Stories, that sounds like a writing organization, not a data analytics organization. Secondly, I think that listeners, based on this conversation, might say, this book sounds very mysterious because it's 2 in 1. And just based on the conversation we've been having, they're probably, what does that thing read like? So I'd like you to read from the book, an excerpt. And then I also want to talk to you about what you're working on next and whether that falls into this phylum or genre. Are you creating a new genre? Perhaps this is a new genre that you're creating, just like the legal thriller caught fire after Scott Turow wrote one. I think he was the guy who really ignited it. And then John Grisham put rocket fuel to it. So let's start with Stories BI. Not a long discussion, just why stories.bi? Why did you call it data analytics? Because there's stories in the data. Is that the idea?
Mm-hmm. So we built an artificial intelligence system that basically takes in a lot of data and outputs stories. So stories that a normal person, a manager in a company or a worker would read, right? So we were basically building on the last or on the previous generation of business intelligence, which would typically show and still is showing users numbers and charts and data. And it basically expects the users to start digging through that data to find something valuable. And we thought, well, this doesn't really work. We have seen many companies where people were simply not using the business intelligence tools, and understandably so. And we realized that the user interface for data simply doesn't work. That we cannot keep thinking that we will teach people how to use pivot tables and charts and drill downs and so on. It's just not a natural interface with the world. And we thought, well, what is, right? And we felt, well, the most natural thing that people consume and that people understand are stories. And so we have, on one side, we have big data. We have millions and millions of records. And on the other side, we have an ideal output, which is the answer to the question, what is really important, right? Like, I'll give you a specific example. Let's say you are an chief HR officer in a company that has 50,000 people. It's a pretty large company. Like, how do you know what is happening in the company? How do you know how those 50,000 people feel? Where you are having some skills gaps? Where are people leaving the company and for what reasons? And how do you understand a body of 50,000 workers? And so our engine would basically take all of the data about these workers in and output just the top 5 or 10 stories narrated in human language that it would find there. So it's a vast
Stories
simplification. Exactly,
from the
it's a
data.
vast simplification of that of that space, right? And it is basically our answer to the what I would call one of the most significant problems that humanity is facing today, which is how do we deal with complexity? Right? Well, this is one way. This is one way how we can actually deal with complexity by leveraging AI to sift through those heaps of data and provide outputs that are natural to us. So that's why we call it stories. And by the way, we had about 200 names for the company until we settled on stories, because that's all we have been talking about.
I think it was a good choice, and hence you tell. This, you're obviously a philosophical guy. You're thinking a lot about these things. You're trying to communicate to people. I'm talking about non-clients with your writing, and you turned it into a story or a compilation of stories that make up a larger story, an overarching story, which is maybe you did this fictionally because it was a more effective way than trying to write it as a nonfiction treatise.
Right.
Is it true, or did I just put words in your mouth? I mean, because one of the questions I would have is, why did you write a fiction book rather than a philosophical nonfiction book saying humanity needs to question things? This is a more effective communications channel, perhaps. But again, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What do you think? Why'd you pick a novel?
So yes, I believe so. there might be reasons for this that go beyond this book itself. I love novels, and I've always felt drawn to them, to the genre. I feel that the tradition of novels for the last couple of 100 years really captures something about the human experience that's difficult to express through other means. Like there is a space besides science, besides other forms of art, that is uniquely occupied by novels, right? And that is something that was always dear to me, and I wanted to write a novel, but I was writing it for 12 years, and it became a book that really straddles the border between fiction and non-fiction, and that really questions, well, what is fiction and what is non-fiction, right? And
right.
In both directions, basically, right? There's one point in the book where the narrator starts asking the reader, well, give me something very real, right? Think of something very real, like let's say the 20th century. Okay, we will all agree that 20th century happened, right? That is a real thing. But then he basically takes the reader through a series of questions, and the narrator arrives at a conclusion that all we can say about something as real as the 20th century are stories, and contradictory stories. And these stories are by no means final. Like 20th century, in a way, is still unfolding because we're adding further and further context to it, right?
Yes.
And we can look at the current events briefly. Like we have a war between Russia and Ukraine, and this war that's happening in the 21st century actually changes the meaning of what Russia is, what Ukraine is, what Eastern Europe is, from what it was in the 20th century, right? So the 20th century is still unfolding.
Part of those reflections, right? Like the 21st reflects on the 20th. The stories evolve over time.
Yes.
And take something as, well, a huge event, of course, was World War II. And we still are writing books about World War II, reinterpretations of World War II, or like amplifications. So it's not, it's the great American writer, William Faulkner, who said, the past is never dead. It is not even past. Very much to your point that we're never past it. And if you think on an individual level, everything we do is built, and everything we think are like bricks being put into place, is all based on this accumulation of experience. And that experience drives our assumptions and our beliefs. And if we go back and we think hard on that again, think about it again and question it, as your novel is beseeching us to do, there could be some significant changes if we ever took the time to do that. Most people don't. So let me ask you this then. I didn't give you really any time to prepare to read something, but do you have something at hand that you can read, like 2 or 3 minutes of copy for us, so that people get the sense of the tonality?
Yes, happily. But I will never do as good a job as the two narrators who are actually narrating the audiobook. Okay, so I would definitely encourage the readers to listen to the audiobook.
Absolutely.
If they like audio.
And but go ahead and set this up for us. What part of the book will you read from? And is Adam the PhD? He's the Cambridge PhD?
That's right.
Okay.
Adam is the PhD, yes. So I will open one of the two books on page 1. It will actually be the Black Book. That is the shorter one. And it is Adam's diary. Okay. So this is how it starts.
Okay.
The rich tend to mistake their bank accounts for self-worth. The famous, their number of fans. The beautiful, their daily approaches from strangers. The muscular, their body mass. The orderly, their punctuality. The intelligent, the number of their quips. Such a variety of scales, and one thing in common. They all use a scale that favors them. Indeed, many find it easier to measure themselves by the number of problems they don't have to solve, rather than the number of problems solved. As for me, it's been my feeling for quite some time that it isn't money, fans, or muscles that make us human. When I searched for a more appropriate measure of life, eager to weigh a human life by its own intrinsic value, I sought its core. And, in my view, there's nothing more intrinsic to human nature, and therefore no better general, natural, or elementary measure of human quality than one's progress along the axis of awareness. And this is not a heady academic phrase. I have myself embarked on this existential adventure, guiding my cognition toward its most essential and basic subject, the self. Literally, that is. When you turned back to Europe, I headed forward toward the unseen end of existence. And this is the diary of the days that followed, conveyed in the simplest language I could muster. If there were an ideal dialect beneath these pages, it would feel rugged and unpolished, as Kutaniaki pottery, hardened by fire, brittle.
Now, is that Adam narrating?
That is Adam, that's correct.
It's a first-person narration. Very powerful. You remind me of really nobody else in particular, but I will say that Tom Robbins, whose writing style is completely different, he's very flamboyant and comedic. But what he does is he interjects his own, although he does it in third person oftentimes, his own philosophical insights based on what the characters are saying, doing the relationships between them. What was really interesting to me, Philip, right off the bat, when you were talking about these scales, number one, we tip them at, we choose the scale or the measurement that favors us, of course, all part of our, constructing the ego and maintaining our self-image. But then also all these measurements, they're all fleeting. They are all transitory. Wealth is transitory. Fame is transitory. Life itself, our intelligence, because the intelligence diminishes over time just because the brain, like the muscles, begin to waste with extreme age anyway. And yet these are the things that we build our self-image on. And it's only a human self-image. It doesn't take us anywhere else beyond this. I mean, assuming somebody believes that there's more to life than just the mortal, then these are not scales that we want to be putting our weight on.
Right.
I would say.
Right. And, I'm wary of analyzing my own book, but you can also notice that there is a question behind these opening paragraphs. And the question is, what is important? Right?
Yes.
And this protagonist is answering that right away in his own words, but also that answer is only pointing a very general direction, right? It's not really clear what is he going to do then. He's basically pointing toward adventure, right? Toward seeking oneself, and that is the beginning of the book, which sets out the direction.
The answers, and tell me, I mean, my own ear is telling me that the answers are almost questions and answers in one, that he's answering it, but he's also questioning it simultaneously. I don't know if you hear that in what you've written, or that was some subtext, subtext just in terms of the way you've crafted the sentences and the thinking and all that. But that's kind of what I was pulling away. That might be my own interpretation.
Yes. Well, yes, and I mean, this is one of those questions that will never have a final answer, right? And yet, it's still so important to be asking it, even with the awareness that we will never know what truly is important with some finality. We ourselves are always changing, right? I think that's one of those one of those certainties. So the answer must also be always changing, but the question stays relevant with every consecutive partial answer.
Yeah, exactly. Now, listeners can tell that here I'm asking you questions, and it's clear that some of these questions are you have not read the book. No, I have not. I haven't had time to, but I am definitely going to get my hands on that audio edition. You've got two great readers who are going to be reading it, Scott Brick and is it Jonathan Davis?
Jonathan Davis. Okay. Yes, Jonathan Davis.
And I'm an audio guy for sure because I read all day, and so I like to listen in the evening so I can actually be active while absorbing, and I almost exclusively novels. I'm really looking forward to this one. Is this a new genre, though? I mean, is there an existing genre you would, for instance, if you had a bookstore, somebody put you inside a bookstore with your book and just said, put it on the shelf where it belongs, where would you put it? Is it under general literature? And maybe you don't want to be part of a genre. I mean, I'm asking, is this the start of a new genre? Would you put it in general literature or general fiction? Or is there a new genre that you could see emerging from this?
Okay. I would put it on the front desk and tell everyone who comes in, hey, read this one.
Talk about tipping the scales in your favor.
I would love this to be a genre. Okay. I would love this to be a genre, and I'll explain why. When I read books, I no longer want some kind of immersion into an illusion, right? When I was 20 years old, I loved reading sci-fi. I loved reading fantasy. I was reading novels and so on. I no longer read these kinds of books, and that is since I basically wrote mine. I found that what I truly enjoy reading are books that have a significant impact on myself, on my thinking. And I often read nonfiction. I sometimes read fiction, but just this goes back to what I was explaining about basically the reality of the 20th century, right? Like if everything we can say about our society is in some way fiction or in some way a narrative, right? Then we need to take fiction much more seriously than just an imaginary narration. And on the other hand, nonfiction, it sounds like, well, that's very, very close to this word truth, right? Nonfiction, that sounds like, oh, that is what things are. And yet my book is challenging that notion as well. So it's doing both at once. It's basically saying fiction is a lot more real than we tend to think. And truth or nonfiction is somewhat more narrative. And this is the intersection of these two genres where I think it's very fruitful to have a combination of narration and insights in whatever form these ideas want to take. Sometimes there's an element of of a story. Sometimes there is an idea put very simply. What is this, right? We simply cannot. I think we can no longer be calling it fiction versus nonfiction.
Something I was going to say earlier is that when you're talking about the power of fiction and telling stories, a lot of people live in totalitarian regimes under totalitarian leadership. And over history, they've told the truth through fiction because they could tell a story that didn't draw attention. They weren't telling it as fact, but they were still communicating to the readers the truths that were not allowed through the media, through the television, newspapers and television and radio reports and so on. Throughout history, it's been a form of truth-telling, the only form of truth-telling available to people. Now, what about this genre? I mean, you hope it becomes a new genre. You want people to take fiction more seriously. Even people who write fiction, they sometimes, there's more to the fiction genre than just telling a detective story, let's say, or a sci-fi story, as you were saying. So could you come up with a name for this genre you're talking about that you'd like to be a part of, or maybe even pioneer? It sounds like maybe you're pioneering this, including the fact that you wrote a book where you could start at the back or the front, which is a really experimental, innovative take on the book. Which, how does that work in audio? You go front to back in audio, right? One book and then the other, but they can be read in either order. So I don't know. I'm throwing too many. This is a compound question. I'm throwing too much data at you, but you're an expert at sorting out the data. So what do you say, Filip?
So I'll answer the last one first. Okay, we're still working out how to actually do the audiobook so that it can be read in either order. It's coming out in about a month and a half, so we still have a bit of time to tinker with that. But we're facing the same difficult question with the hardcover, with the ebook, with our PDF version, and each of these formats required a different solution. So it's actually quite a fun brain teaser to work it out in each format. Now, to your question, what would I call this genre? I hesitate. Okay, I honestly think there will be. There will be other people who will probably come up with a better name than me.
So you don't have? Do you have a prospective name, or you're just saying that's left to the people who do these?
I don't have
critics?
a word, right? I understand. Okay. I understand the space into which I am writing, and it is really right. You were mentioning that sometimes ideas would need to be obscured in stories, right? I am talking about the very opposite, actually. I am talking about writing as impactfully and clearly as possible. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes means writing a story.
Yes. So you're working on your next novel, are you not?
Yes, I am.
What's the subject matter? And tell us a little bit. I know that I've done this over and over with authors. Mm-hmm. Some are superstitious and some say I can't really talk about it. Tell us what you can about it. For instance, is it going to be the same genre? How far along is it? Is Adam a recurring character? Maybe what the setting is, whatever you can tell us that doesn't give it away or violate your superstitions.
Right. Okay, so I will not describe the form, but it will be somewhat different, but again quite unusual. Okay, it's going to be a different kind of experiment again with the form, but I can tell you the main idea of the book. It will go deeper into this direction of challenging our assumptions about reality. And what I'm writing about is that our science and we as a society tend to assume that the mind is a product of matter. And in other words, that consciousness has somehow evolved in the brain. I am writing a book that basically poses this question: well, what if it's the other way around? Let's consider it at least as an equally valid hypothesis, right? Because we simply don't know. So, what if matter is a product of the mind? Where would that take us? How would we live? How would we be thinking about the world if everything around us was really a mental construct? And everything, I mean, including the chair that you are probably now sitting on, and the sun outside, and so on. What if all of that is actually within the space of ideas? And there is a correspondent. So, from this starting point, I am then exploring the question of meaning and the nature of information and data, right? And it is one of the postulations there that we may be actually primarily living in a dimension of meaning rather than a dimension of matter. So rather than this three-dimensional world, we can think of a fourth or fifth dimension, which would be the dimension of meaning, which might well be our primary residence. And I mean in our normal waking life, in our daily life. So what, if you basically start thinking, and I mean this could be in theory close to the simulation hypothesis and to certain strands of idealism and panpsychism and so on. So there are philosophical directions that explore this kind of worldview, and it is what I'm interested in as well. It's basically asking the question: well, if we start from the assumption that everything we see as solid and as matter is actually a mental and energetic construct, what does that tell us? And and that is, of course, without hopefully sliding into some simplistic esoterics.
You enjoy, and it probably is a necessity for you to question these things. So you've taken all these questions and you've made it you write about what you want to think about. You want to think about these questions, so you create characters who are contemplating the very questions that you're contemplating, and you are sorting your way through a lot of these questions in your writing as you write, I would imagine. Is that not the case?
Absolutely. It's kind of like writing becomes the compass, right? Or a it's almost like when
it's
you
a thought experiment for sure, right? You're going through a thought experiment for sure.
Right. When I let go of certain certainties and start exploring the world, well, writing or recording the journey and creating an imaginary capsule around my journey, which the book is essentially an imaginary capsule around my own thought journey, right? It in a way gives a structure to that journey.
Yeah. How far along are you in this book, in your new one?
I have been
percentage-wise, maybe.
This is an interesting one. I've been thinking about it and making notes for the last 10 years. And I think I can just sit down and write it by the end of this year. Okay. That might be wildly optimistic, but that is my plan.
So you've been cogitating on this, and you've been taking all these different fragments, and what you're doing is, I understand what you're saying. It doesn't sound overly optimistic to me. I think that once a person pulls that together, I mean, based on my own experience, there can be an awful lot of thinking that's done. It incubates, and then you kind of give birth to a fully formed baby rather quickly, much more quickly than if you did all of the thinking from page one and just did the thinking while writing. You've been doing the thinking, taking notes, and allowing your thinking to evolve, your characters to develop in your own head, and in your notebooks or whatever you use to record this stuff. And this is very interesting, Philip. I don't feel like we're done. I really like talking to you. I mean, we're done for this podcast because this is the longest podcast I've done so far for Novelist Spotlight, but it was very, very worth it. And I don't feel like we're done. I'm looking forward to down the road when you come out with your next book, or perhaps after I get to read or listen to your to a Flock Without Birds, that we revisit this, because this is very interesting stuff. And what you're doing right now is you're really taking the novel to a place that most people don't take it. As you say, you want people to fiction writers to take the novel more seriously, turn it back into maybe a form that it used to take, or maybe has never taken. Certainly today we have questions that are beyond what we, ask ourselves in the past, just because of certain innovations. But the basic questions are always there. I mean, would you agree? The basic questions are always there. It's always really a matter of questioning, why do I believe what I believe, and what are the alternatives to what I believe, and why do they exist, and on and on. I mean, this has been you've given us a pretty thorough walkthrough of this philosophical construct that you think people should spend more time with. What are your final thoughts before we conclude the podcast, Philip?
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me on the podcast. It was a real pleasure, and I'm glad you gave me space to talk about all these constructs. So I will hope that the readers who found the conversation interesting will pick up the book, dive into it, and start further conversations around this book. Just like, hopefully this conversation between the two of us is just a seed for a web of further conversations that reverberate throughout time and space.
This is heavy book club reading. This doesn't sound like a book club book, but it should be, and maybe it will become that. This is heavy book club reading, because the conversation that would take place after a group of people read this novel would be much richer and far more multidimensional, so much more multidimensional than what do you think really happened at the end of the book? I mean, I love open-ended endings that are open-ended, that leave room for you to think and discuss. Your novel, just based on our conversation, sounds like it could be a long and rich discussion. It's a lifelong discussion, really. I don't want to overrate your novel by saying, once you read this, you're going to spend the rest of your life thinking about it. But that is the novelist's dream right there, is to write a novel that everybody talks about and thinks about the rest of their life. And, maybe this is it. Maybe you have lit a fire. And I'm hoping that's the case, because I love that piece that you read. I'm looking forward to the audio edition. And Filip Dousek has been our guest. Filip, thank you very much for the time, and congratulations on the novel in this really experimental approach to fiction.
Thank you, Mike.